All right, y'all know me. I don't normally do intros on YouTube episodes, so I'm going to keep this super short. Today, I've got two guests, which is admittedly unusual. When I saw the attempted coup go down in Russia this past weekend, I wanted to know more about Wagner, the group that attempted it, and their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. So my first guest, John Lechner, is going to tell us all about that. My second guest is returning to the Jordan Harbinger Show. Brian Klaas is an expert on corruption and coups, among other super interesting topics, and I wanted to know why this coup failed. You might have heard the expression that if you're going to take a shot at the king, you'd better not miss. Well, this was one hell of a miss, and I wanted to know why coups fail and what might happen next in Russia. So here we go. So let's not bury the lead. There was an attempted, or what looked to be an attempted pseudo coup in Russia just a few days ago. Is that accurate so far? I feel like every time I say something, it's out of date by the time it leaves my mouth.
I mean, I'm feeling the same way right now as well. I think when we first saw what was going on, starting on Friday night and into Saturday, to me, as someone who's followed this group for quite some time, it definitely had the air or the feel of an appeal to authority at first, rather than a coup, where events probably got away from all actors at the time, and no one had full information about what was actually going on. And so what may have been initially kind of an appeal to authority from Yevgeny Prigozhin to Putin to oust his main rivals internally, Shoigu and Gerasimov, seemed to have quickly taken on a life of its own and become what appears to have been, at least we can classify it as a mutiny or a rebellion.
So for people who are out of the loop, which is literally going to be the title of this episode, out of the loop, Yevgeny Prigozhin is the oligarch leader of a private military force called Wagner. And we say Wagner because that's how they say it. You can say Wagner. It's the same thing. And the other name, Shoigu, is the defense minister of Russia and some of these other authorities. We sort of have to assume here that, John, that people have no idea who any of these people are, and they're like, what am I hearing about? What is Wagner? They have no idea, right? So let's start from there. What is Wagner? How did they even become in a position to do what they're doing? Let's just start by defining what the company even is in the first place.
Sure. Well, in classic Wagnerian sense, or Russian sense, Wagner as an entity with the name Wagner doesn't exist. It is not a legal entity. There's no company out there whose name is Wagner Group. Wagner is a catch-all term or nickname that developed, and we can go into how that developed, for a network of companies affiliated with Yevgeny Prigozhin, as well as some other individuals, his co-founder, Dmitry Utkin. And it first developed, this network of companies first emerged in eastern Ukraine around 2014, during the first outbreak of war in Ukraine. And
yeah, I was just going to say, what else happened in 2014 in Ukraine? Anything of note?
Exactly. And so essentially what happened was you had this guy, Dmitry Utkin, who's a career soldier, a paratrooper, fought in Chechnya, and then kind of became involved in private security, first going to Syria with a prior private military company, Slavonic Corps, who is a neo-Nazi and a huge fan of the 19th century German composer Wagner. And he essentially shows up in eastern Ukraine with a bunch of other volunteers or mercenaries, most likely part of the Russian government's covert effort at the time to support a local rebellion that quickly turned into a war that could not have been a war without Moscow's assistance to these local forces. And Dmitry Utkin is one of those guys who shows up ostensibly as a volunteer, but as we learned later, part of this forming group of different mercenary companies that became useful to the Kremlin, especially within the context of a covert war in eastern Ukraine.
It's interesting that somebody who's a neo-Nazi is also a Russian nationalist, right? Because my history is not great, but I do vaguely remember learning that the Nazis and the Russians were not on the same side in World War II. So what the heck is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no way to kind of
Square
try
it.
and square that one. Yeah,
Yeah,
and I'm not going to
it's
come to the
just dumb.
defense of not going to come to the defense of Utkin with some sort of logic about how it actually all works out perfectly. But I think what we can say that I think is interesting is that the guys who wind up in these positions, the guys who wind up being mercenaries, military contractors, these types of people, there does tend to be a tendency for these groups to overlap and certainly flirt with white nationalism, neo-Nazi ideology. Very often we kind of find the same types of people, very different structures and governments and cultural contexts, but very often the people who fall into these categories within each country have a tendency to share some ideologies, and white nationalism is certainly one of them. Same with soccer hooliganism. A lot of Wagner guys came from the kind of the hooligan, huge soccer fans of, say, St. Petersburg's football team or soccer team, Zenit. A lot of these guys have come out of, I would say, kind of general fans of guns and training, self-defense, martial arts, MMA, all of these kind of small cultures, niche. I wouldn't call it white nationalism niche, but like all of these kind of milieu and cultures also feed into
There's a fancy word you don't
mercenarism.
often hear associated with Nazis. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
you
interesting.
told me to bring it in beforehand to work one word in that. Yeah.
Yeah, you nailed it. That's really funny. It does make sense, right? It's kind of like the tough guy who beat people up in the street outside of a soccer game because he's a punk loser with nothing to do, goes to the MMA gym and decides to be a career gangster criminal, and then the state needs gangster criminals that are willing to kill people for money, and they're like, hey, this is the only thing that I really have any skills in doing, and then they join this organization, and it doesn't really matter that they're also a neo-Nazi because the logic doesn't have to square. They just need to be willing to be violent for rubles, and that's the end of it.
And at the end of the day, I mean, this portion makes up and made up certainly at that time a pretty vocal and central component of Wagner Group, but certainly not all mercenaries within Wagner Group hold this ideology. And certainly as it expanded, you saw far and far less people with that type of ideology. I think probably like everywhere else, the biggest feeder for folks working for these types of companies is that you have a huge pool of guys with military experience who come out of the army and very often are bored and want to relive some of that adventure, and they're not happy just sitting as a mall cop or the mall cop equivalent in Russia. These types of opportunities to go abroad again, to participate in events is sometimes, and frankly, just the money is something that can be very attractive to the guys who have this type of experience.
They recruit from the military, but it sounds like they also recruited a bunch of people from prisons. And I think some people know this, but let's speak to that a little bit, because they had this huge number of soldiers in Wagner. They lost like 20,000 of them in Bakhmut, but then somewhere during that battle, they needed to replenish their numbers. And they went to prisons and essentially emptied them out of able-bodied guys, from the sound of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think essentially what happened was, at least kind of initially during the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, Wagner was actually initially sidelined by other guys in the Ministry of Defense, his old nemesis Shoigu, who wanted to bring in his own private military companies, his own private armies, who were more closely affiliated with him. So when the war in Ukraine broke out, actually last year, on February 24th, 2022, Prigozhin's guys, Wagner, were nowhere to be seen. it was really only after the Russian military started facing some setbacks that they were forced to go to Wagner. And the reason that they were forced to go to Wagner is because a private military company is essentially, at the end of the day, a logistics company. It is a company that is contracting, and its job is to move men and material to places that people need them, the people who are paying. And so Wagner is as good as its Rolodex. It's as good as the spreadsheets of people with contact numbers who they can call up and recruit and get manpower. And that's what the Russian government, all of a sudden, about a month into the war, needed to tap into. And that's how Prigozhin got back in. And he initially brought in a lot of very talented guys because, contrary to, say, the Russian military and soldiers just in the Russian military, these guys had about 8 years of experience fighting in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, fighting in Syria, Libya, Africa. I mean, these were talented guys. And so they initially made a big difference. But like you said, he started losing a lot of those guys. And it became necessary in general for the Russian government to bring more men to the front line. And one of the solutions, we don't know whose idea it was, but it would seem typically Prigozhin, was to go to Russian penal colonies with an offer. And we can talk a little bit about what that offer was, because
Yeah.
it was very interesting.
So I would love to talk about that offer, because I think I would take a pretty low ball if I was going to die in a Russian prison or spend the next decade in there, because prison in the United States, notoriously terrible. Prison in Russia has got to be even worse by probably by a lot, especially if you're in, I don't know, Siberia or someplace that's not near Moscow. I would imagine it's as close to a living hell as you can
Yeah.
get outside of, North Korea or something.
Yeah.
So to say, hey, remember when you killed somebody and you went to prison? How about now you kill somebody and you get out of prison? And they're like, well, what's the, sure, where do I sign? I mean, that's what I would say if I'm in their shoes.
Yeah, I had the opportunity. I was in Ukraine. I had the opportunity to talk to a few of the convicts who were
Oh,
recruited and
wow.
fought for Wagner, and then were captured. And it'll be something that I'll be including as a shameless plug in my book. But there were a few interesting things I think that I came away from. One, to answer your question, when I asked the guys how many people signed up, they said only about 1 in 5. So you have a very
I'm
interesting
surprised.
selection process going on here, where you have the folks who tend to not think about consequences very much, who wind up in a Russian prison, and the guys that I talked to were usually there for, in kind of a very typical fashion. Oh, we got in a fight over my girlfriend. We both had knives, and my knife by chance happened to plunge into his neck. And what do you know? They gave me 20 years.
Uh-huh.
Um, and Prigozhin came and gave this offer, which was essentially, if you fight for 6 months and you survive, and he was very open about it, their chances of surviving, according to them. He even said, I'll take you out of here alive. I will not necessarily return you alive. And only God or Allah can spirit you away, and that will be in a wooden box. And so he was pretty open in their minds about what the chances were. He told them as well that the losses were 2.5 times Stalingrad, and Stalingrad is something that resonates with a lot of Russians as a pretty
Wow.
particularly tough battle. And so after giving that speech, about 20% of guys decided to sign up for it. A few of them that I spoke with, it made sense. I mean, they had 20 years, they had served 8, they felt that they were in a hellhole. Like, why not just take a chance? Got nothing to live for. I talked to one guy who was in prison for beating someone up, and he had 3 years. He had already served 2.
Not a good ROI. That guy's
Yeah.
decision-making process, not that I should be surprised, is slightly flawed. I mean, either survive another year in a prison, which I'm sure is terrible, or go to, again, if they were really clear about the odds of survival, 2.5 times Stalingrad, you just know you're getting thrown into a meat grinder. You're probably being used as like a bullet pad to show where the Ukrainian snipers and machine gun positions are.
Yeah, 100%.
Wow. I mean, I would not have made that same decision.
No, I think, yeah, you and I are on here speaking with microphones, and so we're far removed from whatever, pathway that probably led those guys to be making those types of decisions. But it was fascinating to speak with some of these guys and kind of get the sense that they're not victims. They felt like they were given a chance and they felt that their odds weren't that great, but at the same time, they didn't seem to give a sense of feeling taken advantage of. And it was clear even through all of that they had some serious respect for Prigozhin and felt that he was some sort of great charismatic leader, which I think we can come to later in terms of the mutiny. But it was fascinating to see that they still didn't really have anything bad to say about him. And I think that they were being pretty honest.
No, I would imagine that makes sense. These guys didn't surrender, right? They were captured. So that tells you kind of all you really need to know in combination with their testimony there. So is Wagner, and this is something that's been in the news today even, is Wagner really private or is it an arm of the state? Because Putin seems to have either made a slip of the tongue or just decided, screw it, and the wool is off everyone's eyes. He kind of said, this is run by us. We're paid. They were paid. The whole thing is part of the government, whatever way you slice it. What do you think?
I think two interesting statements were made, and one by Putin, essentially saying that Wagner was receiving support out of the state budget between May 2022 and May 2023, which times up, I think, pretty neatly with the beginning and where we are kind of currently in the war in Ukraine. And then his press secretary, Peskov, then went out and said that actually the Russian state has nothing to do with Wagner's African operations. And I think that kind of having traveled around and having followed this group for at least 4 years now, I think that actually makes some sense. And the reason I think it makes sense is I think Wagner has represented something that is particularly difficult for us to analyze and to understand. And that is, it's a private military company that is profit driven, but at the same time represents the interests of the Russian state. That shouldn't be too difficult for us to understand. I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., and I'd say 90% of the companies here are profit driven that work in the defense industry or something along those lines, and also are ostensibly furthering the interests of America abroad, whether it's through selling arms and jets or what have you. We're the center of contracting, probably. But what I think is unique about Wagner specifically is we have had private military companies in the past, like Blackwater. But Blackwater would embed itself within our national security infrastructure, that is the American national security infrastructure, to try and make as much money as possible. Other PMCs, and Sean McFate, who used to be a contractor, has written a great book about this, The Modern Mercenary. Other styles of PMCs like Executive Outcomes, which was a South African firm, kind of famous in the 1990s and had the movie Blood Diamond sort of based on it.
Oh, interesting.
They were essentially made up of white South Africans coming out of the post-apartheid or the apartheid regime. They couldn't work for the South African government. The South African government didn't really have anything to do with them. So they had to go out and contract with other governments, with the Angolan government, with the government in Sierra Leone. And what's interesting about Wagner is I think that it's somewhat a mixture of Blackwater and Executive Outcomes. Not only can they embed within Russia's national security infrastructure, but they also have the freedom to go out like executive outcomes and offer their services to other governments. And they don't have to deal with a Congress, an opposition party that's going to drag them before for a hearing because a bunch of opposition politicians want to drag Putin through the mud. That's not going to
Right.
happen.
Not in that regime, not in a dictatorship like that. That's for
Not
sure.
currently,
If there
but
were opposition
yeah,
politicians to be heard from, they might not be able to do it anyway.
yeah, well, they've certainly caused some reputational risk in a very different way this past weekend.
Yeah.
So it comes back to bite you, whether you're Bush or Putin, I suppose, but in a very different way. But to your point, that means that they can both receive contracts from the state, be supported by the state, but also try to make money elsewhere. And that's what makes it so difficult to analyze.
Right. That's a great segue into my next question, which is where do they operate, right? Because they're operating in Ukraine. Now they're in Belarus doing whatever. But you mentioned Syria. You mentioned Africa. I know before we get to Africa, there was a Syria incident that we talked about kind of pre-show that's quite famous. There's a leaked phone call of, I guess, a Wagnerite mercenary talking with, I don't know if it's his girlfriend or family or something, and he is very unhappy and describing them just getting absolutely massacred by U.S. air power in a matter of minutes. What was this all about?
So this actually, I think this case could actually be an interesting way to show the evolution of the group. I think it's safe to say that when Wagner first went to Syria as contractors, they were most likely employed by the Russian military, and they participated in attacks on Aleppo, on Palmyra. I think very much in lockstep with their contacts, their touch points within the Russian military intelligence and probably other handlers. It seems like at some point, probably late 2017, maybe early 2018, the contracts with the Ministry of Defense dried up. And so Wagner decided to go out and search for other ways to make money. And through an entity called Yevropolis, they struck a deal with the Syrian government to help them recapture and protect oil fields in exchange for 25% of what those oil fields would make. So a good way to kind of incentivize, right?
So retake the oil field from, I don't know, ISIS or whoever else, and you get 25% of the take, which is really good. I mean, you're talking about an operation that could take a couple of days and cost you some lives that you kind of care about, but not, I mean, whatever, and then you get millions, tens of millions, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars over the years from just making sure that it stays in Syrian regime hands, secured by Wagner.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good gig if you're the one sending people. Yeah, probably a little bit less so. I don't think the 25% kick really made it down to the average contractor who's probably paid by the month. But if you're in management, it's not a bad deal. But but essentially what happened at one point in early 2018 was a contingent of Wagner personnel, probably around 600, together with some local forces, decided to attack a base of the, I believe it was the Kurdish SDF at the time. And either they didn't know or they didn't care, but there were some American special forces who were also at that base. And these guys were approaching, and essentially the U.S. called up through their kind of deconfliction line with the Russians in Syria, because all of these countries have to have, try to make sure that they don't shoot at each other and cause a world war, I suppose. Right. And so they called up the Russians and they said, "Are these your guys?" And the Russians said, "No." And so they got the green light, and the U.S. came in. I'm not sure we know the exact details, but the U.S. came in with firepower that was, to put it mildly, unnecessary for the threat, most likely. And for 600 guys lightly armed, I think we were flying kind of multiple jets were coming in, using the big bombs, and it did not go well. Obviously, it wouldn't go well for anybody in that position. It's not very fair to say to Wagner, "Oh,
No,
sorry,
they got left twisting in the frickin' wind, to say
they
the
got left
least.
twist." Yeah, to say that this was, somehow up to like their lack of talent would
No,
be
no, no.
kind of
Not
like
that I'm
very.
defending these pricks, but like you're not going to fare well when you've got an Apache gunship and you think you're sneaking in someplace through the desert. So they
Yeah,
got torn up and they
they got
lost
torn up. They lost.
hundreds of people.
Yeah, probably around 300 guys or so, and the United States military made a point to the Russians or to Wagner, don't ever point a gun in our direction again. And I think that point was understood because we haven't seen something quite like that in the time since. But one big question, and it's one that I'm continuing to look into, is why exactly did the Americans get that green light? And in light of kind of the tension that we saw ratchet up into a mutiny, I think it goes to show that at the very least, it could have been human error, of course, or it could not have been. But certainly after, we could say that internal rivalry and internal tensions within Putin's system have always existed. The difference is that they have a tendency to be behind closed doors.
Right. So at the time that happened, I thought, wow, what a cluster. These guys the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And then I kind of evolved to, maybe Wagner wasn't supposed to be there. They needed plausible deniability. They couldn't say, yes, those are our guys, because then it's like, well, then how did you know they were doing this? Don't you know better than to send your guys into these places where the U.S. soldiers are and you're not even supposed to be here? And now I'm thinking there's at least a chance where they said, oh, Wagner's attacking this oil platform. You know what? I'm sick of those guys. I'm the defense minister. You know what? You tell the U.S. to tear those guys up. I want to watch this happen from our satellites or our drones or with my binoculars or whatever. I want to watch these guys get lit up because I'm sick of this guy. This guy's a thorn in my side. And I want to see him take one on the chin. And there's a much higher chance of that now, in my opinion, than there was a couple of weeks ago. At least in terms of me thinking that. I don't mean that the chances have changed, obviously, but now it seems like it's more clear that there's at least a possibility that was essentially deliberate. Just let them walk into a trap and let the Americans just destroy them, because we can't do it. They can't hit each other without looking really bad, but they can certainly let the United States bloody their nose, and it just looks like they just messed with the wrong bull.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be great to try and get to the bottom of this. Who knows? It might be something that we never do, because there's only so many people in the world who know exactly what happened, and I'm sure they're not likely to share
No, a
either
lot of
way
them are
at
going
this
to fall
point.
out of windows in the next 90 days, I think,
Yeah,
is what's going to happen.
but at the very least, it was probably a testament to the point, to the fact that there was not a lot of command and control going on. The ties at that time, or at least the command and control between Wagner Group and the Russian military, was very weak, and it doesn't seem that the Russian military was. If they were super concerned about Wagner, they would have double checked perhaps and
Yeah.
said, "Hey,"
Maybe
beforehand, and
made a
said,
"phone
"Hey,
call,
where?"
sent off a text
Yeah,
message.
like
Are these
sent
your
to them, be
guys?
like, "Hey, are these your guys?" But apparently that that would be safe to assume that maybe that phone call wasn't made. But
Right,
more to come,
exactly.
hopefully, on that incident.
Uh-huh. So how is Wagner funded? We mentioned that earlier. We saw some news reports that Putin said, hey, we paid these guys 160 billion out of the state budget, or whatever it was, 80 billion out of here, 80 billion out of there. But that's not all, right? The oil platforms that they've retaken in Syria, there's some funding there. What I found interesting was these guys are in Africa, and there'll be a Chinese-run mine, or there'll be a locally run mine for rare minerals or some kind of precious stones, and suddenly the miners end up dead floating in a river, and Wagner has secured the mine and expanded it. So what's that all about?
Yeah, there's several kind of different incidents to disaggregate, but essentially, when Wagner first arrived in the Central African Republic, they arrived in a fairly, I would say, normal or typical role, in that their job was to provide training to the Central African Armed Forces, which is known by the French acronym FACA, and in exchange, they signed some mineral concessions to different mining rights. The notion of PMCs being used, private military companies being used in Africa, especially for large countries, big powers like Russia or the United States, is not anything atypical or necessarily new. I think it's safe to say that in general, the Africa is, unfortunately, and I wish it were otherwise, because it's a place that I love and want to work at all the time, is not very high on the list of national security military priorities for either Russia or the United States, or their respective publics. And so what that means is, when American soldiers or Russian soldiers die in the field, there is a tendency for a public backlash and for people to want to know, why did this happen? I mean, I think Somalia is a great case in point. When the United States lost several people in Mogadishu, Bill Clinton pulled out, right? He pulled the forces out immediately. It was a massive scandal. Why are we over here? You don't have to report contractors in either the United States or Russia, and so that is a big plus. They usually are cheaper as well, so you don't have to invest significant treasure. So you neither have to invest blood or treasure, but you can still essentially have a footprint that various people in government want to have. So when they first came, it was a little bit strange that it was Russian, because typically the PMCs, or the people who are usually over there, are the French. Central African Republic's a former French colony, but they were essentially on a training mission. What happened next was they tried to bring together different armed groups, because CAR was in a civil war, kind of a low-grade civil war at the time, into a peace agreement. They did for a little while. And then essentially, with elections coming around, 6 of the 14 armed groups broke the agreement, started a new alliance, and they charged on the capital of Central African Republic, Bangui. Wagner, in addition to Rwandans and a UN peacekeeping force, defended the capital. And then they pushed back on a counteroffensive. And actually, they took more territory than, or they returned more territory to the CAR government than they had in years. Usually the CAR government only controlled the capital. And then it was kind of a various deals with armed groups outside over who runs the mines, how the cash flows work. And so Wagner was just kind of the newest actor in a very in a conflict that had existed for quite some time. And what they did was, I think they leveraged their importance within basically the FACA, the Central African Armed Forces, couldn't have done what they did without Wagner. And
What's
I think
strange bedfellows, though, Wagner, the UN, and Rwanda, that is
they all found
bizarre.
themselves technically on the same side at the time, and there's some very weird little complications that can arise on the ground. I was there.
I can imagine.
When there was the threat on Bangui at the time.
You were in the capital at the time?
I was in the capital, yeah.
How is that when the local government is so weak they can only hold one city, and you've got Russian mercs in that same city, and you've got UN peacekeepers in that same city, and then suddenly Rwanda rolls in and is like, we can do this. How are you not immediately on the first plane home?
Well, the flights stop.
Oh, well, that'll
when
do
you're
it.
in that kind of situation. So, yeah.
Gotcha.
You were stuck.
Okay. Did the hotel prices quadruple overnight at that point? I imagine they would. You gonna leave?
You would think so, yeah. But yeah, usually the flights kind of stop, or they become a lot fewer. No, it was an interesting time to be there.
I would imagine,
for obvious reasons. And strangely, the UN peacekeepers Rwanda and Wagner all were on the same side. It's not too strange because we've now found ourselves in this very strange world with this new version of PMCs where they are supposed to be on the same side. The
By the way,
role of the
PMCs, I don't know if we I think we defined it earlier, but private military contractor is
yes,
what that is. So Wagner, Blackwater, whatever. Yeah.
yeah,
Continue.
and I mean, essentially, the way that the UN peacekeeping forces work or tend to work is that they are invited in by the national governments to then keep the peace between the various parties. The original idea of peacekeeping was that a peace agreement is reached and then it's to be kept. But the tendency now, or very often, is that they find themselves in peacekeeping in an open conflict.
Yikes.
That's not ideal, given usually mandates and their own effectiveness. And so Wagner has come around at a very interesting time, kind of an existential crisis in UN peacekeeping, where a lot of folks in Central Africa, in the Central African Republic included, have seen years and years of peacekeeping and things not get better, and there be more armed groups. And so Wagner has been popular among a lot of Central Africans because some folks want a military solution. They don't like the armed groups. They want to see them out of the country, in jail, or eliminated. They see the UN peacekeeping forces incapable of doing that. And both of these entities are effectively invited by the Central African government. And in strange times, even though they offer kind of antithetical solutions, one a peaceful solution to a conflict, the other a military solution, they're now finding themselves on the same side. Same issue is happening in Mali at the moment, and the UN is pulling out. Yeah, they're kind of two different sides of the coin, and in weird circumstances, I would say it would be difficult to say that they were working together, but they definitely were making sure that they weren't shooting at each other. They definitely were. I think in some incidents, they were offering, to stay in each other's bases. I mean, what's strange about when you go through a town in car at this point, when you drive through the countryside,
CAR is Central African Republic.
Central African Republic.
Not sure what we're talking about.
Is you'll see a Wagner base right next to a UN base right next to a Central African Forces base. And so these guys are, ostensibly, I would say there's no love lost between them because the UN is constantly criticizing Wagner, and Wagner thinks of them as essentially ineffective at best. But they're right next to each other at all times. They're right on top of each other. And I think that there's the potential that that's going to be the reality, whether Wagner exists or not going forward, because they've introduced a model that invariably will be attractive to other governments.
Yeah, I think you're unfortunately onto something there. And I understand the people of the Central African Republic wanting, if you're going to be under the thumb of armed groups, at least make it the same damn armed group so you don't worry if you're going to get dragged out of your business and killed because you said those guys, you paid those guys instead of these guys and it's Tuesday, so these guys are in charge now and now you're the enemy. Just pay the one warlord or whatever that's doing the thing. You know who to be afraid of. You know who your friends are. If there's one group, maybe they're not fighting in the area where you're supposed to be working and not earning any money. I mean, it's a mess, but it's better the devil you know.
You've essentially made the pitch that Wagner makes to
I would imagine. Yeah. And I'm not defending some of these terrible people, but it's kind of like it's either going to be unworkable and not survivable at all, or it's just going to be a living hell.
And in a place like the Central African Republic, I mean, we have to remember this is the least developed country in the world. 70% of people make less than $1.20 a day. It's a country the size of France, probably has about 300 kilometers of paved road total. So we're talking people who are in a desperate situation, and improvement in people's lives can be as simple as, is it safe to go to the next village? can I trade a little bit to get X, Y, or Z? And that is how narrow people's priorities
Yeah.
can be.
Wow.
The unfortunate reality for a lot of people when you live in decades of conflict is very rarely do you have the choice between a good guy and a bad guy. Usually your choice is between a bad guy and a worse guy. And Central Africans aren't naive to think that Wagner doesn't come with consequences. They absolutely know that. But when you're living there day to day, you have a tendency to have a more nuanced perspective and a very local perspective, which is literally are things better now? They are a little bit good, and it doesn't have a lot to do with disinformation, what people think about the war in Ukraine, geopolitics, anything along those lines.
I want to talk about the coup after our piece here. We're going to do a segment with a coup expert, Brian Klaas, who's been on the show before, writes for The Atlantic, among other places. Just an amazing coup expert. But I will ask you as well, this coup is very odd, right? What happens? What supposedly sparked this? Prigozhin says Wagner was shelled by the army. Sounded like BS, but now we're kind of thinking maybe that actually did happen because those two factions are fighting. And he decides suddenly, I'm going to go to Moscow and negotiate a change in leadership in the military. That was his initial smokescreen, was it not?
Yeah, I think, we were talking about the incident in Syria where Wagner was clearly bombed. I think that there's a lot of very smart people who call into question whether or not the incident where Wagner claims that it was shelled or hit was staged or not. I think ultimately what we had been seeing for quite some time and within kind of Putin's system is that it was feudalistic. Essentially, you had various oligarchs, powerful individuals who control various institutions and are always duking it out with each other over the state's resources. And they would certainly fight, but for the most part, they would take these battles to court, where maybe the outcome was already determined, but there was some sort of kind of legalistic framing, smokescreen around usually what was happening. What Prigozhin did was, for the first time in a very long time, try to basically get the attention of the leader, Putin, by giving a naked show of force. That is like in the most classic sense of feudalism, that is what you would do. Is you have local princes essentially within the empire or the country who periodically rise up when they feel that they're being marginalized, treated unfairly, misallocated, and by showing your dangerousness, you're showing that you matter and that you have to be dealt with. And that's how you, in a most basic sense, get what you want. So what we saw is something that's been going on throughout history.
Tale as old as time, yeah?
Yeah, as old as time. It happened to be something that we hadn't seen in the past 20 years or so in Russia, and it was very surprising.
It's something you hear about happening in Sudan, right? The general went to the palace and shot the guy, the president, or Haiti, right? Like some military guy went in there and shot the president while he was sleeping, and now they got a new guy, or they didn't get a new guy.
Well, I mean, interestingly enough, Sudan is literally going through a similar thing where a paramilitary structure has been built up, and a lot of people thought that it would never bite the hand that fed it. And then sure enough, in both cases, the entity, they bit the hand. And so it shows that at the end of the day, I think the most important thing is that it's revealed to people that there's more than one guy in Russia. And Putin is not the only guy. He is not sitting around with a million TVs in front of him, controlling what's going on. It's a constant battle between people just underneath him for his ear. And at the end of the day, the way that we get into this mess is because he doesn't really like to make decisions. And so he lets things fester, and usually somehow things have managed to kind of slog along. But Prigozhin is a unique individual, and he's shown that he is ready to always assert his own agency and cross whatever red lines we assume exist in the system. He just like steps right around them.
I'm wondering why he thought he would get what he got. And it seems like today, in fact, just the other day, a top general was arrested because they said, hey, you knew about this coup in advance, which kind of begs the question, how did that guy know about the coup in advance, and why didn't he say anything? And the only real answer, and I think Putin has come to that same answer because he arrested this guy, is he knew about it because he was supposed to support it, and then at the last minute either lost his nerve or decided, actually, I don't really like Prigozhin, and this was I was just going to let him walk into the vacant elevator shaft, into that open elevator shaft, and plunge to his death. I was going to tell him, yeah, I've got your back, and then as soon as he stepped over the Rubicon, he decided not to lift a finger, and that's why we got Prigozhin driving almost all the way to Moscow and then probably looking around and going, are you kidding me? We're the only ones doing this? I thought I had an army behind me. Would you agree with that?
I think it's very tough to tell right now about like speculating on what's going on internally. There's a lot with that specific general. He was probably the general who had the best relationship with Prigozhin, but that by no means means that he was certainly behind this thing. The knee-jerk reaction of Putin is going to be to purge. Yeah. And
usually you overcorrect when you purge.
You usually will overcorrect, and fortunately for the Ukrainians, this particular general is probably the smartest one that Russia has. And so there's probably going to be a purge of who would be considered kind of the more nationalistic elements, the people who have not shown beforehand loyalty, like Shoigu, like Gerasimov, who were Prigozhin's main enemies. And sure enough, I think it was Shoigu a few days ago got awarded a medal, and some other very loyal guys also got awarded a medal for their readiness to fight to the death to defend Moscow. And unfortunately for the Russian military, those guys are not the most loved. They're rewarded for loyalty, not for their IQ.
Good old dictatorships. That's what could go wrong.
Yeah, they're really effective, except that they're not effective ever.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So how does a guy who becomes a chef, because Prigozhin was a caterer, right? They call him Putin's caterer. It's not a euphemism. He was literally just a cook who led a catering company. How does that guy become the leader of a private army? That's kind of a weird development that I think most people don't understand, myself included.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I've never tried his food, but like, I don't think that he was necessary.
I also would not try his food.
Well, yeah, we'll see.
If I were in your shoes. After your book publishes, definitely do not try any of his food. Actually,
maybe
you probably
before.
won't. You won't have a chance to, because he's gonna fall out of a handful of windows, or tie himself to a chair and throw himself in a pool.
We're gonna have to see. I mean, really, his story is that he, I think around the age of 18, he went to prison for petty theft. He was born in 1961, so very much a product of the Soviet Union. Went to prison. At some point when he got out, he was a hot dog vendor. And somehow
hot dog
managed.
vendors didn't mean to laugh.
So yeah,
just not what I expected to hear.
Yeah, no. So I mean, in terms, maybe he cooks a great hot dog. I mean,
Russians are known for their American
for their
street
dogs.
food.
Yeah. But he managed to work his way up to owning a restaurant. I don't know if he ever cooked for it, but he seemed to have at least hired good chefs, because a young Vladimir Putin at the time very much enjoyed it. And he's a smooth operator, clearly, because he managed to leverage that connection, and I'm sure others, into the very lucrative world of contracting for the Russian military by providing its food. And that's how he became known as Putin's chef, is because of that essentially the contracting to the military and schools as well. And I think he poisoned a few kids at some point
By
with his
accident?
food. By accident. Well,
Through incompetence, yeah.
Yeah.
Slash not caring about the quality of the food, right?
Yeah.
Jeez.
I don't think, I mean, maybe. I mean, I don't think he was, I mean, I don't think he was literally like, let's
trying to poison children. Yeah, what's the difference, I suppose, at that point with that level of corruption? Because I noticed they said that he was paid $80 billion for catering, and I was thinking, what kind of food are you making for $80 billion?
That's doing the meals for the military.
Okay.
And so in that sense, you're starting to make sense. I mean, imagine, what the food budget for the U.S. military is. It's probably
is it 80 billion? I mean, that still sounds like a lot.
80 billion rubles. 80 billion rubles.
True,
$1
true.
billion. Yeah.
Okay, that's more believable. That's more believable. So he gets to Moscow. He ends up standing down. We don't know what Putin negotiated or promised him, but basically, Wagner is now out of Ukraine, correct? And they're in exile in Belarus.
So I think, as far as we know, Prigozhin, we've heard that Prigozhin is in Belarus. What we've heard the deal is, as it stands, is that there's amnesty for those who participated in the events. Members of Wagner can either sign a new contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense, or they can join Prigozhin in Belarus. We don't know to what extent Prigozhin will still be in control of the organization, of the operations in places like Africa. I think it's safe to say that Wagner probably won't be in Ukraine anymore. They want him as far away from there as possible, and they obviously want Prigozhin himself out of Russia. There's been rumors of arrests of various Wagner personnel in Syria. That's another country that's important to the Russian military and the Russian government in general. But again, with the Central African Republic, I think in the near term, it's not a high priority. They've got bigger fish to fry with a full-scale war in Ukraine on its borders right now. And it probably would take a significant amount of time to replace those guys. You have to think about, if you're the CEO of any company and you come in, you don't want to fire all 2,000 employees on day one and then just bring in 2,000 new people who don't know anything about Africa or anything along those lines. And you certainly wouldn't expect the ship to sail smoothly. So I think they're in a bit of a dilemma, both on what to do with these African operations. It may have been part of the deal that he's allowed to keep them, but then the question essentially remains: how does he source? How does he finance? We think maybe some of the operations, like in Central African Republic, I mean, I think that he might be able to self-finance that, but he was usually getting his equipment, I think, from the Russian military. So where's he going to go to get that? I mean, that's going to be a crucial question down the line.
That is interesting. How important were they as a fighting force in Ukraine? It seems like they did better than the military. I mean, the only even sort of victory that the Russian army has had in Ukraine in recent months is Bakhmut, and that was largely Wagner. So if they're gone, and Bakhmut was not that, it's not Kiev as far as being kind of a big deal.
And the thing is when you drive over to the outskirts of Bakhmut, you realize that along the way there's the equivalent, I mean, of just Bakhmuts at every single turn. I mean, Ukraine is it is an industrialized, developed economy. It has so many cities of, several 100,000 people. Each one of these places is a Grozny for the Russian army to take. And so you just have to imagine that they're going to have to face a number of Bakhmuts to even get close to Ukraine.
So it seems like the Russian military is fighting without Wagner is significantly degraded now in Ukraine.
Yes and no. I mean,
could
Bakhmut
be significantly,
also could be
is a better word.
But they, at the same time, they had declared victory in Bakhmut, and there were issues going along, and they essentially, Wagner, Prigozhin, declared victory in Bakhmut on May 9th or May 10th. And then he said, I'm handing this over to the Russian military. We're out. So when he crossed over into Russia, his forces at that time were not being used on the front. And so we're not really sure, I think, and there are a lot of people who are the real military experts, and they aren't me. I'm just like dumb enough to go to CAR and try to look at stuff. But I think the folks who are real military experts would probably say that it's too early to tell if that's going to have an effect.
I got to say, this whole coup, there's no sort of classy way to say this. Definitely blue balls for a lot of us watching this, I think, right? I was kind of ready for something. In Wagner, I mean, this whole thing has been weird. Even Game of Thrones had a better ending. And it's like the Russian army was the second strongest army in the world, and then it's the second strongest army or third strongest army in Ukraine, and now it's like the second strongest army also in Russia. What the hell?
Well, I mean, one thing that we should remind is like is weird things can happen, and I think one of the things that we can't ignore when they went in and we're getting close to Moscow is when there's a lot of uncertainty. It's human nature. People are loath to create certainty by doing something like shooting someone. And these guys are on the same side. Wagner and the other kind of Russian military personnel who were along the way. And usually for like a civil war to take place, you need a time period where there's significant polarization, like dehumanization of the enemy, so that you can prepare yourself essentially to kill them, because it's just not an easy thing to do. And there was none of that. These guys just were going, and if I was a Russian soldier, the last thing I would want to do in that moment of confusion is just be the guy who shot one of these guys.
Yeah, no kidding.
And so if you put that up on a large enough scale, it makes sense. I mean, the United States here in Washington, D.C., I'm sitting in the most powerful nation in the world, and a bunch of pretty much unarmed protesters managed to storm the nation's capital and get pretty far. And this is a convoy of dudes who are armed. So it's unsurprising that they fell into a surprisingly small amount of resistance.
I mean, imagine being one of the Wagner soldiers who shot down a Russian helicopter, and now there's no coup. It's like, whoops.
Yeah,
who saw me do that?
Well, they said amnesty, so that's what I would be trying to call for.
I would just be saying, good thing that wasn't me. I would, amnesty, but maybe not for the guy who shot down aircraft.
I'd be changing I'd be changing my call sign for sure.
For sure, because they say amnesty, but then like the next day they're raiding Wagner officers' houses and taking vans full of money, and there's videos of Wagner troops who then joined the Russian army being killed very slowly and gruesomely, videos being posted on Telegram. I don't know if that's happening widely, but they certainly didn't like that guy. And can we dispense of the conspiracy theory, for lack of a better word, that Wagner, that this whole coup, this is theater, they just wanted to secretly or have cover to move Wagner to Belarus, and now they're going to attack there. It just seems like the dumbest sort of explanation. They could have moved Wagner to Belarus in a million other ways. It's the equivalent of shooting yourself in the foot so you can get a free trip to the hospital because you need to pick up a prescription. It doesn't make any sense to me.
That's a good way to put it. I mean, the old rule of like never, if there's a more simple explanation where people are just really dumb and I'm sure that there are a lot of incompetent people involved in this entire thing, then it's unlikely to be a conspiracy. I think that you would hope that this would kind of put the final nail in the coffin of this idea of Putin as playing 5D chess while the rest of us are playing checkers. But I think the people who are convinced of that are never going to be unconvinced of it. And so, it's just an unfortunate reality of trying to talk about Russia is that, I mean, it's like the show Veep. the scary thing when you get into the room with the center of power is you look around and you realize these are just normal people, and that's
Well,
even
yeah.
scarier than the conspiracy theory.
It is, especially if you see like those hearings with Mark Zuckerberg and the senators, and he's trying to explain how Facebook works, and you're just like, holy crap, these guys are going to regulate AI. We are doomed. This guy probably doesn't even understand what Gmail is. This is insane to me.
And it's the same thing. I mean, you're dealing with a ton of very imperfect people, and people who kind of by default of getting to where they are at that level in the government are probably not the most creative thinkers. Prigozhin actually does know how to think out of a box, because, I mean, as of now, he's remained alive after doing one of the craziest stunts, or probably the craziest stunt during Putin's 20 plus years in power.
I would say so. Another question people have had, if it's so easy to get to Moscow, why doesn't Ukraine just do it?
Well, that's because there's a Russian military in between.
Right. I mean, okay. But people have been asking these questions. I know it's dumb, but like, they don't know that, hey, Western allies, I would imagine the U.S. has said, maybe don't take the war into Russia. That could lead to escalation. Also, you're going to face resistance because maybe Wagner drove in and people were either confused or they thought, well, these are our guys, what could go wrong? But if Ukraine rolls in there, it's not going to be the same reaction.
I mean, there's an active front line. The idea that like a bunch of Ukrainians can like just get into an Uber and go around it, and then from the behind somehow like it doesn't work that way. The reason that it, to the extent that it worked, was because clearly no one expected it. Clearly all of the vast majority of men and material were on the front. And so no one was expecting your guys from behind to just make a run for it.
Sure.
But there's no way to get a foreign force somehow behind that line and then going on a beeline like oh God, I'm forgetting the name of that movie.
Oh, well,
you know what I'm talking about.
There's a couple, but it's like
Mad Max. They're just gonna Mad Max it.
Mad Max it. Okay, I thought you were going somewhere else with that. Yeah, that's a good point. On a simply practical level, when your supply lines increase, that's a problem too, right? So you can't just like go around the front and then do this. And that's even more of a problem when you're smaller, like Ukraine is, you're low on resources. And in fact, that's historically one of the reasons that invasions of Russia have failed. And right now, maybe ironically, Ukraine is benefiting from Russia having to deal with that exact same problem.
Yeah. I think that what's happening right now is not something that Ukraine could have pulled off, for the very kind of clear reasons that we stated. And I think that they will try to take advantage of this. But I think right now the biggest consequence that we can probably think of for the Russian military is just the psychological damage of something like this happening. I mean, can you imagine sitting in the trenches as a soldier and just watching just this absolute cluster going on behind you, and you're just like, wait, why are you?
I'm risking my life over here for this, and they don't even know who's running the show.
And it's just a clown show and back. Yeah. And so, and I think one of the things that made it so tough for Putin, and probably the reason that Prigozhin is still alive too, is that you don't want to be out, and it's going to be a poor term after what we were just discussing, but figuratively speaking, you don't want to be outflanked by people to the right of you, the people who are more nationalistic.
Oh, interesting.
If you're a regime. And so your political legitimacy matters, especially in a time of war. You don't want to be getting criticized from the right, from the people who are the more jingoistic, pro-war people, which Prigozhin certainly was. And the last thing that you want to do when he's claiming that, you and the top brass have become this, corrupt, sluggish, kind of out of touch with the Russian soldier. The last thing you want to do is martyr him and like 300 of his guys. It's like literally out of a movie. It's a trope, right? Like the corrupt top brass and then the loyal to Russia 300 or however many people who die for the true Russian values. Like if you're Putin, that's the last thing that you want is to martyr this guy. Because if you martyr him, you validate his entire argument. And so they're faced with an actual conundrum on their hands. And I think that's also part of the reason why you didn't just see a missile come in and take him out.
Mm-hmm. No, you may be right. What's going to happen to Wagner now? They're in Belarus. They're possibly going to have a base there. If they're not going to make a go for Ukraine, what are they going to do? Sit around and enjoy the local? I mean, what are they going to do?
I mean, it's like the end of like an Ocean's 11 movie where everyone goes to Hawaii and enjoys the money that they made.
Right. I mean, did they just all schlep off to Africa and then Prigozhin watches over his shoulder?
I think folks are kind of talking about maybe they're able to keep their Africa operations, but for the same time, there's a lot of logistical difficulties that we kind of discussed already about keeping those, right? Not being able to leverage the state for your flights, sourcing material and equipment. There's a whole headache of other things that they would have to try to figure out. So, I mean, the short answer right now is just that we really don't know where this is going to go organizationally.
Geez, if I'm Prigozhin, I'm calling China as quickly as possible and finding a new, maybe a new master to serve.
I'd be listening to this show because we've been bouncing a lot of good ideas.
I know we have. I know it's funny. It's funny. People have said before, like, you better hope Putin doesn't listen to this.
Yeah. I'd be like, yeah.
John, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know you're writing a book on Wagner. Maybe Prigozhin will stay away from Windows until then. When's the book launch? How much time do you need him to stick around?
I think it would be great, probably until the summer of 2024.
All right. Well, we'll see if Putin and or Prigozhin can accommodate that request. But in the meantime, thank you so much. Really interesting conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. Brian, thanks for doing the show, man. I know you have a super interesting field of study. You've been on the show before about corruption, but also coups. Pretty damn cool area of academic research.
Yeah, I've sort of traveled around the world interviewing people who have carried out coups and failed to carry out coups and have gotten sort of caught out and gotten tortured. Generals, soldiers, rebels, that sort of thing in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and post-Soviet Europe. So it's a very weird field of study, but it's an interesting one.
It's got to be strange to research coups because you ask one side and they go, what coup? Because they're the ones who won or were challenged and the other guys are maybe dead. So...
Well, it's really interesting because actually it's difficult to measure what a failed coup is because sometimes dictators invent them. There was a time I sort of uncovered a fake coup plot in Tunisia where people had thought it was real. And these poor soldiers had basically just gotten dragged out of the barracks and tortured just because the dictator wanted a pretext to purge the military. So it's very difficult to measure the data because sometimes they just fake them. And the coup plotters never tell me the real reason why they did it, which is usually power or money. Right? They usually have some sort of pretext. So you have to basically listen to people who lie to you and read between the lines about what they're really doing.
Wow. That's a whole different show. By the way, you were here on the show before, episode 650 on the corruptible influence of power. Really, really interesting episode. But we're here to talk about Putin and coups because speaking of fake coups, I'm not even sure what the hell just happened. And I think a lot of people are in the same boat. Your article in The Atlantic, which I'll link in the show notes, was fascinating. You mentioned since World War II, 2/3 of dictators have been deposed in coups. If I'm a dictator, that statistic is not comforting at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's the main way they get ousted from power. And very often, even when we think there's a revolution, like, in the Arab Spring, for example, there were revolutions in the sense that they were broad-based mass uprisings. but the actual thing that got the dictator out of power was when the military turned on him. And that's the way it tends to work in these regimes, is you can sort of weather a little bit of protest. You don't really care that much if your people don't like you. It's what the people in the military want. And that's why every dictator, when they come to power, starts making precautions to basically insulate themselves from the risk of a coup, because they know it's the most likely way they're going to get taken out.
You mentioned that the coup is usually a faction in the military, and I believe I copied this from your piece here, half asleep last night, but you said when the coup is carried out by a faction within the military sector, as has happened in Russia, so we're talking about Wagner having possibly attempted whatever this coup was, the dynamics become more complicated. Such a coup plot is not like a battle in which the bigger, superior force tends to win. Rather, the plot will likely succeed less on strength than on perception. Flesh that out a little bit, because that certainly seems to be very likely. I mean, I don't know a hell of a lot about military, but when a mercenary force that doesn't even have any air assets goes against the entire Russian military, despite their performance in Ukraine, I'm immediately thinking, how do they expect to win? This is virtually impossible.
Yeah, so this is a big difference between civil wars and coups. So civil wars, you actually expect to fight. And that's where the force strength actually matters. So it matters how many guns, how many tanks, how many soldiers you've got. In a coup, it's all about perception. And the reason is because basically nobody actually wants to fight. The Russian military didn't really have much interest in fighting Wagner, and nor did the Wagner group have much of an interest in fighting the Russian military. So what they're trying to do instead is they're trying to topple the government through effectively what's called a coordination game in political science. It basically means they're trying to convince people they're going to win in the end, and they need to join the winning team. So I liken it to a sports team, right? I mean, the fans abandon the team when they lose all their games because it's pointless. They're not going to make the playoffs. As soon as they start to get towards the playoffs and it looks like a serious championship drive, all of a sudden the stands fill up. And that's exactly what happens with coups, is you're trying to make it seem inevitable because nobody wants to be caught out on the losing team. So if you're part of Putin's elite and you think that Prigozhin's going to win, you're going to abandon ship because you don't want to be the loyalist who then gets tortured after they do win. So if you're someone who's part of the Wagner mercenary force, you're basically thinking to yourself, well, if we get caught and we lose, we might die. So all of this is sort of a confidence game. And what you're really hoping to do when you have a coup plot underway is you're trying to convince the other side that it's inevitable. And as soon as you do that, you win. Because what happens is there's a sort of bandwagon effect where elites, senior figures in the Russian military, for example, would start to defect. And for that to have successfully been carried out, this coup plot would have needed to maintain itself for longer. As it were, it fizzled pretty quickly. And as a result, people waited on the sidelines, and they waited long enough to not have to make a decision.
Mm-hmm. That does seem to be, now that you explain it from the outside, what happened, right? They roll into this Rostov-on-Don. Wagner rolls into Rostov-on-Don, this military hub. People kind of don't seem to care. And I think it was you who pointed this out in your piece in The Atlantic. The soldiers are just running around getting coffee from places that used to be McDonald's and are now like, Russo coffee or whatever. Nobody seems to care. Like they just go to work and go home again and drive around the tank that's blocking their way home and take a different route. And it's just another day in Russia, like a Grand Theft Auto reality, right? And they just don't care. And then the guy leaves and he gets a couple photo ops of people shaking his hands, whatever those were, and then leaves. And now those same people in that city are just going back to work, but the tank isn't in their way anymore. It's comically ridiculous. And yet it seems like he rolled in, everybody sort of looked on, and then he ends up turning around so quickly that any military leader who was thinking like, do I get my Spetsnaz guys and join these guys and march on the Kremlin? Let's see what happens. They went to bed and they woke up, or not even. They took a nap and they woke up and it was over already. And now he's just supposedly somewhere in Belarus, and all is well for Russia. It doesn't make any sense. There were like, at least from the sound of it, from the look of it, very few defections either to or from Wagner or the Russian military.
Yeah, so the main thing to understand here is that information flows don't operate the same way in dictatorships as they do in democracies. So in other words, Putin doesn't really know the strength of his adversaries or who really supports him because everybody lies to him. So he has no way of knowing whether his elites are actually going to hold strong or defect, in the last minute. And the same thing, the Wagner group really doesn't understand the layout either. So what ends up happening is they sort of roll into this town and everyone's just looking around and thinking like, who's going to win this, right? We don't want to get caught out. So nobody knows where the momentum is. And this is where the political implications of the coup are actually quite profound for Putin, because everybody has now seen something they didn't know, that somebody is willing to challenge Putin. And that information is not going to go away, right? So Putin doesn't know the real strength of loyalty within his regime. He does know that now everybody is looking around and thinking, is there going to be somebody else who challenges me? And that is very, very damaging for a dictator, because once the floodgates open, where it's like the myth has been shattered, the myth being everyone loves Putin, right? As soon as that's been shattered, then the question is somebody else waiting in the wings? And that's where dictators get really paranoid. And that's why the most likely outcome of this is going to be Putin trying to assert control through purges and trying to do sort of shows of strength. And it's the kind of thing that dictators do to sort of reassert dominance after they have had this moment of obvious vulnerability that's been on display for everyone else.
I noticed on the news they showed Shoigu, who's the defense minister, who I guess Wagner was saying, hey, we need to get rid of this guy. He showed up pretty quick. And it seems like that level of very deliberate visibility is from Putin to say, not only did you go home or go to Belarus, not even home, you just went to Belarus in exile. The guy you wanted to get rid of, here he is on TV giving a press conference. We didn't capitulate to any of your stuff. That's not why you left. You didn't leave because you got one of your demands. You left because we kicked you out of here knowing that you were going to leave in a body bag or you're going to leave on your own because you're in my good graces for the time being, because I'm so benevolent, or whatever that sort of message was. It almost seems like Putin has coup-proofed himself in some ways by showing up on TV right away. Although you can kind of hear the anger and fear in his voice, or am I imagining that?
No, I mean, I think this is the most dangerous time he's had in his 20 plus years in power. Coup-proofing is something that happens both sort of long-term and also in the actual moment of a coup being underway. So the long-term stuff is actually creating structures that are like your insurance policy. I've been around Madagascar, for example, where there are literally cars parked outside the palace, and the people who live there and sort of work there in this elite special forces unit, their only job is to shoot back if someone shoots at the president. And that's all they're paid to do, right? So you pay them an extra amount of money so that when the coup happens, they don't turn the guns on you, they shoot back. So you have things like that. You also play, various factions off each other. So they jockey for power and they want to tear each other down. That protects you. And then during the actual coup itself, the main thing you have to do is be highly visible. If you look back on the history of coups, a lot of successful ones have taken place, believe it or not, when a dictator is under general anesthesia, when they're actually taking a surgery abroad.
Because I was going to say, is that a literal thing or a figurative thing? So literally asleep. Okay.
Yeah. It's done very, very carefully. It's why dictators are very cagey about talking about their health. Because if you know that they're going to be literally asleep under, having a surgery, let's say you're an African dictator who's traveled back to Paris or London for a surgery, that moment of vulnerability means that extra time, let's say it's 6-8 hours that it takes you to actually muster a response, that's enough for the government to fall. I mean, coups usually are carried out. This is the Russian one was a bit of an exception. They're usually carried out in less than 6 hours. So this is, it's a situation where speed and timing actually make a huge difference, which is why I said, look, nobody knows how this is going to turn out, because these things are extremely contingent events. Sometimes the timing is really good. You catch a break, people bandwagon to your side. All of a sudden, the government collapses. Other times, you're unlucky. The timing's bad. Erdogan in Turkey in 2016 went on FaceTime and broadcast to the nation, and he did that because he knew that if he waited to go to a studio, his government might actually collapse. So he just instead broadcast from his phone.
That shows you the need for speed. If they're going, sir, we need to get you to the main studio with all the lighting, and you're like, no, I'm 3 hours away because I'm at my cottage. Where's my iPhone? Where's my iPad? Turn all the room lights on and open the windows and get me a microphone if we have. I mean, that's when you're defending your regime using AirPods, you're potentially in some trouble.
And it's literally what happened. He was away from the city. And that's why they struck when they did. So, I mean, it's why dictators are really paranoid about travel and orchestrating their movements. And they usually put in, when they go on, sort of international trips for diplomacy, they usually have very strong contingency plans in place where they've delegated what to do if a coup happens, because they all know. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? Like, most of these people came to power in coups. So they understand pretty viscerally that it's the way they can get toppled as well, and they learn on the job very, very quickly.
Yeah, wow, interesting. So what other ways has Putin coup-proofed himself, right? He's got, it makes me, now that I hear you talk about this, it makes me think all this stuff with Priggy going on Telegram and doing these videos about how Shoigu's terrible, and Shoigu being like, what are you talking about? You're just a dumb mercenary. That almost seems like he's got those two factions fighting. Now, whether that bit him in the ass a little bit with Wagner going, hey, look, we're getting away with this. Why don't we just drive to Moscow? I guess that's another story. But what other ways has he created infighting and things like that? You do see a lot of oligarchs falling out windows, and I wonder if that's part of it.
Yeah, so there's the culture of fear stuff, where it's obvious that, standing up to Putin is a very, very dangerous game. There's the factions where none of them want to let the other one get an upper hand because that means they lose. So sort of playing people off each other. There's sort of these elite special forces units within some of the Russian intelligence branches, and those are supposed to be the line of last defense, the sort of Praetorian Guard. And then you also try to make sure that nobody gets their own individual power base. Now, I mean, one of the reasons why the Wagner Group, I think, was allowed to do this is because the imperative in Ukraine became more urgent than coup-proofing. So normally it's the case that a dictator will not allow any single force to amass a significant amount of power because they understand they're like the enemy within, the potential enemy within. But because they had the enemy without, which was Ukraine, the enemy outside, he allowed, the Wagner Group to develop its own power base, and that's what ultimately led to this moment. There are even strategies that dictators use where when somebody gets popular, they give them a plum post as the ambassador to, the United States or France or something like that to get them physically out of the country. And it's, packaged as this nice honor. And, often the person likes being able to take their family to this elite, sort of experience in Europe. But it's literally done just because it's hard to launch a coup from 3,000 miles away. So, there's a trade-off in dictatorships as well between coups and civil wars. So if you let people amass power internally within your regime, then they can take you out in a coup. If you sideline people, like what's about to happen with the Wagner Group, it seems like, is that there's a risk of a civil war. Because even though that's unlikely, I think in this case in Russia, in at least the short term, the more you push people outside the regime and they can't get power for themselves inside of it, the more there's a sort of risk of sort of outsider violence. So the more you damp down the coup risk, the more you increase the civil war risk, and vice versa.
You mentioned that it's hard to let any group gain power. That seems like in dictatorships, I may be overstepping here. It seems like then in dictatorships, you can't have a super powerful military because they're the people who are going to overthrow you. So by sort of virtue of the way that Russia works, he has to limit military power, which is not great because you're fighting a war in Ukraine against a NATO-trained army. So how's that going to work?
Yeah, I mean, there are trade-offs here, right? I mean, one of the things I did research in Tunisia, and after the Arab Spring collapse, they realized they basically didn't have an army because the dictator had sidelined the army and had set up a private police force, secret police. And that was loyal to him, right? So he wanted to downgrade the army and sort of upgrade this loyalist, police force. But then, when the dictatorship collapses and you can't have the secret police, you actually need national defense. So there's like a trade-off here, and they had to rebuild the military from scratch. There's other places where, what you do is you try to sort of rotate generals. And this is a classic hilarious case in Madagascar, another of the countries I work in, where there's something like, several thousand generals. I think it's 1,000 generals for like 6,000 soldiers, something like that. And it's just because they keep promoting people to buy their loyalty, and then they rotate them. But it's hilarious because it's like the most top-down structure. And then all the generals fight each other and they keep each other down. So, I'm not an expert on the Russian military, but I would say that this is the kind of thing in coups that you look at a situation like these trade-offs and you think, what's my most imperative problem now? Well, for Putin, for the last several months and certainly for the last year, it's been military dominance in Ukraine. But, the more you amp up those generals, delegate to them, do all the things that make them an effective fighting force, the more they get bastions of power. And that's where the cracks in the regime start to show. So dictators are basically people who are constantly living in fear and always taking actions that decrease one form of risk to them and necessarily increase another form. There's no costless action. So whatever they do is going to risk that they have down the road, a new threat to their power, and they just have to make a lot of short-term decision making, which is why they often break apart catastrophically in the end.
Right. It's all just sort of how do I get through the next couple of months here and not let's think about what's going to be good 10, 20 years from now. Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. All right. In closing here, one of the worst things for a dictator is to look weak and or to have those cracks show, like you mentioned earlier. Putin definitely just got a slap across the face from Priggy. So he can't let that go, right? I mean, yes, he exiled him to Belarus. Who cares? That guy's got to fall out of 3 windows now, I would imagine, before this. He can never fix this, right? This is the vase has shattered onto the floor. He can glue it back together, but you're still going to see the cracks. What do you think he's going to do? What do you think we're going to see in the next few weeks or months for him to try to make up, for him to try to glue the vase together in a way where maybe from the outside you can't really tell?
Yeah, so there's a few things here. One is that you have, again, a trade-off. So if you go too hard against the coup plotters, you might actually make more coup plotters, because there's people who are sympathetic to this mutiny or coup plot, whatever you want to call it, and they're going to be angry if there's too much of a crackdown. So there might be a second wave, right? But if you do nothing, if you look weak, then there's going to be coup plotters who are just opportunists who think, well, this guy is going to fall anyway. I might as well be me who's in charge. So there's a sort of sweet spot. And there's some research from a couple years ago in political science that basically shows that sort of modest purges that don't harden the opposition to the regime, but do send a clear message to the regime's opponents are what actually works best for maintaining power for longest. So, I don't think that Putin reads political science journals, but if he were to, the smart move here, unfortunately, I'm not trying to give advice to Putin, but it's the sort of thing that tends to work in these regimes is to do enough of a purge to, show your dominance, but not so much that you alienate larger sections of your elite class, which frankly, in this instance, are already pretty skeptical about Putin because of the war going so badly.
Right. So we don't really know, but I know there's some raids going on Wagner officers' families, and they're kind of saying, hey, we're just going to look through all your stuff and treat you poorly because you were on the wrong side. So maybe he's trying to toe that line a little bit, right? The idea that, okay, we might not throw you guys out of windows, but we want you to know that you have to join the military now or retire. You can't just go back to Wagner and keep making money in a private army and maybe threaten me again. You have a choice here. You're either with us or you're out of the game entirely, or you will die a horrible, slow, painful death.
Yeah, I mean, I've written something to this effect where I've said, look, it's very difficult to predict these situations because they're extremely different from each other. But the one prediction I am pretty confident about is that Yevgeny Prigozhin is not going to die an old man. I think that's pretty clear. And he's not going to die a natural death, because ultimately, it's probably not a wise move to do anything really severe right now. But 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road, I think that guy is going to be watching his back for the rest of his life, and with good reason.
Definitely. Yeah, he's going to be checking his teeth with a Geiger counter if he's smart. Brian, one thing I probably should have asked earlier, why did Prigozhin attempt the coup in the first place, and why did he think he would succeed? It seems like he read the room really poorly.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that it's worth speculating on, but there's no clear answer. It seems very unlikely that he actually thought he was going to seize power. Putin was not going to just let him. And unless there had been a mass sort of defection very quickly from the elites around Putin, this was probably doomed to fail. And most coup plots do fail. But, he did abruptly turn around the troops. And that's where, the speculation is around what leverage Putin had. A classic ploy for dictators is to threaten the family of a coup plotter, or to just say, look, we're going to kill you when this is all over. And that's a pretty credible threat from Vladimir Putin, especially because the Russian state has the ability to kill people anywhere in the world. And so, even if he were to flee in exile, they would know that they could get targeted at any point. So I think that there's delusion, ambition, misreading. Maybe he thought that the entire apparatus, all the oligarchs, et cetera, would immediately turn on Putin, but that clearly didn't happen. And given how long it took for the sort of convoy to approach Moscow, there was a lot of time for Putin to prepare. And the best coups, the most successful ones, are genuinely lightning strikes where they last, a few hours, and the dictator's arrested in the first hour, the airport is seized, the airwaves are shut down, and none of that was going to happen here. So, I didn't know what was going to happen during it because these are very difficult to predict events, but my money would not have been on this one succeeding just because the kinds of things that have to happen were not happening.
Yeah, there's that saying, if you take a shot at the king, you better not miss. And this just seems like a huge miss. And you're right. I don't think he's going to be sleeping very well for the rest of his potentially very short life. Brian Klaas, thank you very much. I know you've got a Substack going. We'll link it in the show notes, but is there any other, and we'll link to the Atlantic piece in the show notes as well. Where else should we send people? Because you do have fascinating content. I read pretty much all your stuff, at least all the stuff that I find online.
Yeah, I've got a podcast called Power Corrupts, and the Substack is called The Garden of 14 Paths.
Great. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.